Maritime Made on Eastlink TV is presented in partnership with Nova Scotia Business Inc., novascotiabusiness.com.
Propeller Brewing is one of the original craft breweries in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This award-winning brewery has led the way in helping to create a dynamic craft brewery industry in Nova Scotia since 1997. After 20 years, Propeller continues to make delicious beer right here in the Maritimes. To begin brewing grain, known as malt, it's transferred from the outdoor silo to the grain mill, where it's milled in preparation for brewing. The outdoor silo holds 30 metric tons of grain. Specialty grains are added in smaller amounts for different recipes to create specific color and flavor profiles.
To start the brew, the brewer adds a base amount of water according to the recipe for the type of beer they are brewing. This brew requires 250 liters of base water. Then 750 to 1,000 kilograms of grain is pumped into the tank called a mash tun. Generally speaking, more grain is required for a darker beer than a lighter beer. Hot water fills the tank from the top. An even grain bed is important in the mash tun, so there aren't any clumps of grain in the mixture. It takes 30 to 40 minutes to fill the mash tun. An internal rake keeps things moving and the grain bed even. This tank is heated and cooks the grain to a porridge for roughly 1 hour. The heat helps to optimize the amount of sugar in the finished liquid.
The liquid produced at this stage is called wort. The tank pumps the wort out to the second tank, or kettle. The brewer removes the porridge-like substance, known as spent grain at this point. This takes some time and effort. Once removed, the spent grain will be picked up by local farmers to be used for animal feed. And the tank is cleaned thoroughly, ready to begin the next brew. The brewer checks the system controls of the kettle. Once the wort is 100 degrees, the bittering hops are added. At this stage, the kettle is 100 degrees for 5 minutes. Aromatic warrior hops are being added. 3.5 kilograms are poured in. Hops will be added at 3 more stages throughout this boil. The hops added here add the bitter flavor. The hops added later in the boil are for aromatics. A yeast nutrient and more hops are later added.
The brewer carefully tracks every step and the timing of each step to the recipe. Because there can be differences in the total volume of wort extracted from the mash tun into the kettle, the brewer measures to see how much has evaporated to ensure the recipe will be accurate. After about an hour in the kettle, the wort is transferred to the whirlpool. The brewer sets the speed of the pump. It takes about 40 minutes to transfer and then gets a 20-minute rest. As the wort level rises in the tank, the pump turns faster to help pull all the hops into the center. This circular motion helps to collect the hops in the center and keep them out of the next tank. Aromatic hops are added in the last stage before fermentation, and the circular motion helps the flavors to blend. After the whirlpool, the brew is on its way to the fermentation tanks, but not before going through a heat exchanger to reduce its 80-degree temperature to 20 degrees. Too high a temperature would kill the yeast necessary for fermentation.
Before the wort is pumped out of the heat exchanger and into the fermentation tanks, yeast is pumped into the receiving fermentation tank. The spout of the fermentation tank is sanitized and connected with clamps to the hose. A supply of carbon dioxide is attached to help keep the flow of yeast moving. This fermentation tank is ready to receive the next batch of wort. There are 14 fermentation tanks on the production floor, holding a total of 1,000 hectoliters of fermenting wort at any given time. Over days and sometimes weeks, the fermentation taking place is the yeast consuming the sugars. For the yeast to do its job, the temperature of the tanks is carefully controlled. Most recipes call for 22 degrees. Checks on the sugar levels are done daily. The brewer performs a test called a specific gravity test that is done with a hydrometer.
The brewer takes a sample from the fermentation tank. The brewer moves the brew from pitcher to pitcher to remove oxygen. Then the specific gravity is tested. It takes patience, but once fermentation is complete, the final filter is done as the beer is pumped into a bright tank, where it is carbonated before bottling. Next step is the bottling line. Today, this hydraulic line is bottling 3,000 bottles per hour. A depalletizer machine lifts 320 bottles at a time onto the conveyor belt. One at a time, each bottle is moved into the wringer, where each bottle is turned upside down and is sprayed with a burst of water to clean the bottle. As each bottle is cleaned, it is moved around and out of the wringer machine. The bottles now move into the filler machine. The bottles are blasted with a burst of CO2 and then immediately filled with beer. A tiny burst of hot water is blasted to remove any oxygen at the last minute before the bottles are capped, one at a time. Removing the oxygen from the bottles at this stage is important to improve the shelf life of the beer.
The capped bottles move along the bottling line to the labeler. But first, the bottles pass under a series of vacuums to dry off the bottles, so the labels will attach to the bottles. Then adhesive is added, and the labels are attached one bottle at a time. The bottles then continue down the line. Efficiency is important on the bottling line. The bottles keep moving as a worker checks the date, that the label had adhered properly and straight, and each bottle is not leaking. After each six-pack is hand-checked, each box is loaded onto the automatic case sealer. Here, the boxes move through and are first stamped with the date, then glued and sealed shut. The six-packs are then loaded onto a pallet, where they're prepped for shipping. Today, this crew will have roughly 10,000 bottles ready for shipping. The quality lab is an important part of production at Propeller breweries.
This test involves checking the CO2 levels inside a finished bottle. The cap is pierced, the bottle is agitated, the temperature is taken, and the pressure is measured. At Propeller, they make sure the beer is tested in the lab. But they also make sure it makes sense to taste buds. Twice a week, a minimum of 5 people create a tasting panel. They sample 6 different beer in their taste test. The local craft beer industry is booming in the Maritimes. Propeller delivers kegs to over 150 bars and restaurants. At Propeller, kegs come in 50-liter and 20-liter sizes. Kegs are first washed, then filled, and shipped to be enjoyed as draft.